I wanted to take a moment to talk about our sponsor, Alt21, the foreign exchange and hedging platform that reduces the risk and costs of cross-border transactions. As a board member, there are few better feelings than making a suggestion which adds quick material value to your organisation. I remember when one of our board members saved us $50,000 with a quick introduction to a group discount scheme for one of our key suppliers. I continue to feel grateful to this day. Alt21 can offer exactly this kind of quick win for board members. By using their foreign exchange and hedging services, you could reduce your company's costs by 90%. For a company that has just 10 million foreign exchange exposure through its revenues or cost base, that could be over 300,000 back into the business. Alt21 are so confident that they offer the best value in the market. They show you how much they make from fees in real time before and after any transaction. If you want to save your organisation money on its foreign exchange and hedging, head to alt21.com. That's alt21.com to find out more. Hello and welcome to Enter the Boardroom with Newroll. I'm your host, Oliver Cummings, CEO of Newroll, the board search specialist and market leader, bringing science to the art of board hiring. Today's guest, Dr. Tomas Chamorro-Premuzic, is the Chief Innovation Officer at ManpowerGroup, co-founder of Deeper Signals and Meta Profiling, and Professor of Business Psychology at both University College London and Columbia University. He has previously held academic positions at New York University and the London School of Economics, and lectured at Harvard Business School, Stanford Business School, London Business School, Johns Hopkins IMD and INSEAD, as well as being the CEO at Hogan Assessment Systems. Tomas has published 10 books and over 200 scientific papers, making him one of the most prolific social scientists of his generation. He is a frequent contributor to Fast Company, The Guardian, Forbes, and the Harvard Business Review. Tomas, a huge welcome and thank you so much for joining us today.
It's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Regular listeners of Enter the Boardroom will be familiar with the journey we've gone on in thinking about boards, which it's worth briefly recapping to put my first line of questions in context. It's clear boards have a hugely important role in shaping the organisations which shape the society we live in, and when done well, they have a hugely positive impact, but when done badly, they have a hugely negative impact. And unfortunately, most boards are dysfunctional, and that's what we are hell-bent on changing. It was argued persuasively in episode 62 by Roger Martin that boards, at least in public company settings, add no net value. Good CEOs will seek out advice anyway, bad CEOs will pull the wool over boards' eyes, and there is nothing they can do about it. But I think that misses one of the fundamental roles played by the board, which is hiring and firing the CEO, which should be a continuous process. And that's where it struck me that your work on why do so many incompetent men become leaders offers such a valuable mental model for board members to add to their armoury. So perhaps we could start, for those not familiar with your brilliant book, a brief summary of the key insights that are relevant for those on boards.
In a nutshell, the argument is that we're not very good at judging leadership talent, let alone potential, either in ourselves or others. And the two are actually connected. First, like other dimensions of talent, leadership talent is one where the vast majority of people overrate themselves, overestimate their talents. But then on top of that, there is a paradoxical evolutionary process or effect at play, whereby, in essence, the more you overrate yourself, the more likely it is that other people will overrate you as well. Particularly if you're a man. This actually is not so common if you're a woman, even though you would think that difference is decreasing in a world that is, or at least was until 4 months ago, becoming a little bit more gender egalitarian. So on the one hand, you have that. We're not very good at rating our leadership talent or potential. And the more we bullshit ourselves, the more likely it is that we bullshit other people into thinking that we're better than we actually are. And then on the other hand, once those people who get to the top, not because they are good, but because they manage to persuade others that they're good just because they think they're good, once they get there, incompetence kind of trickles down. And if you're not very good at your job or not very good at understanding leadership, you're going to hire people who aren't even as good as you, and so on. So in a nutshell, what the research shows, it takes competence to not just spot, but also stop incompetence. And that when we select leaders, despite the fact that we live in a world in which data are ubiquitous, AI is almost commoditized, and everybody can do data science, and you would think organizations and boards can be very evidence-based and data-driven. Actually, when we select leaders, including CEOs, we play it by ear, we focus on style, no substance, and we end up with people who are overconfident rather than competent, and men overestimate their talents more than women. So that also explains the gender difference. So we end up not just with more men than women in leadership roles, but also more incompetent men than competent men in leadership roles.
What I took from that is that the skills that are required to get you into these roles are different from the skills that are required once you're in those roles. Now, that makes a lot of sense and resonates on many levels with me. I suppose one question, if it's that simple, quote unquote, and you take that evolutionary theory and apply it in a free market, that would lead me to expect that those organizations who identify that mismatch would ultimately outcompete those who don't, because they get better leaders in place, therefore they do better, and therefore their sort of hiring process outperform. And over time, you'd expect those who fail to understand that mismatch to die out. What does that line of thinking miss?
On the first part, it's not just that what gets you there is different from what lets you do a good job once you get there. Sometimes there is actually a tension between those things, and they might even be diametrically opposed. So in any organization, if you're really good at self-promoting, blowing your own trumpet, managing up, and you engage in ruthless Machiavellian tactics of manipulation, and you blame others for your mistakes, and you take credit for other people's successes, you're probably going to get to the top faster than if you do the reverse. And when those people get to the top, they don't suddenly become ethical, competent, other-oriented leaders, right? So that's the first issue. On the second one, it would be nice if we could actually sample, I don't know, S&P 500 or Fortune 500 or a list of companies and see, oh, okay, let's take a look whether the people leading or running the companies that are the most successful or highest market cap companies in the world actually resemble or embody the prototype of competent leader as opposed to the narcissistic, arrogant, incompetent, deluded leader. But it doesn't work like that, right? I mean, already I'm sure our listeners are thinking about, I don't know, Mark Zuckerberg, right? He doesn't feature in textbook examples of leaders who have technical expertise on leadership, who are values driven, and I'm only using him as an example. In fact, it's well documented that his leadership style actually mirrors a lot of the negative, counterproductive, immature, obnoxious, and even somewhat narcissistic features of incompetent leadership I describe. But if you have a monopoly in social media and you're very dominant, it's going to take a while for us to see what the impact is of your leadership. So a better way to understand whether the effect exists is actually to look at large-scale studies, control studies, where within an organization you see in pretty much standardized environments how effective are teams when they're run by leaders who are competent rather than confident, who have technical expertise, who have EQ, who have integrity, who have people skills, who have self-awareness. And you have 100 of those. And then you have 100 who are in the other end of the spectrum. And what you see is that about 40% of the variability in team performance, same when you look at board teams, by the way, can be explained by the qualities that I just described. So in the competent group, teams will be more productive, have higher profitability, more innovation, better levels of work-life balance, well-being, morale, fewer levels of counterproductive work behaviors. And the opposite is true for those run by incompetent leaders. So the evidence is out there, which begs the question, why aren't people addressing this? Why aren't boards addressing this? Partly is due to short-termism. If you're focused on the next quarter or this year, etc., and the stock market is up, you probably are a little bit more relaxed about that. Partly it is because nobody does it, and you have to be the first. That's actually true leadership, is not copying or if everybody else hires somebody with an MBA who comes from McKinsey and who is a 50-year-old white male engineer, so will we? And there's a lot of studies, for example, on how even when companies try to do the right thing, like appoint more females to their board of directors, often the stock goes down because the market or investors perceive that this is an anti-meritocratic measure and therefore they sell. So you have to truly go against the current or the flow. And then the final issue is, of course, as they say in America, the turkey doesn't vote for Thanksgiving. If you are the incompetent leader at the top, you have no interest in disrupting yourself and in bringing somebody who is competent, because it means it's the end for you.
If you take that example of the way stock markets react, I love that wonderful line of Buffett's that the markets in the short term are a voting machine and in the long term a weighing machine. So for that sort of organization who runs counterflow, who suffers in the short term from the voting effect of the market, if they stick to their guns, I would expect them to start benefiting and then the weighing effect of the market to kick in and the better performance to kick in. And then I would expect them to start winning in that market and that behavior then to spread more. All the things that you've talked about, that short-termism, nobody does it, the sort of short-term stock impacts, and then turkeys voting for Christmas, those I would have thought would all be things that would be overcome by the forces of Darwinian evolution, that a better process would overcome those. But why not?
I think that is what happens, indeed. And if to stay with Warren Buffett and Berkshire Hathaway, if you look at their investment strategy, it is in the long term and it is well-run companies. Well-run companies tend to have higher levels of engagement, higher levels of retention, lower levels of corruption, harassment, counterproductive work behaviors. They don't feature scandals. Of course, that's not true for all of their investments. But on the whole, whether they are giving boards and CEOs an assessment of integrity using psychometric tests, AI or not, isn't the point. The point is that, well, to use another one of his quotes, it takes 20 years to create a positive reputation and 1 minute to break it, right? And if you think about that, you'll do things differently. Turns out that they make a lot of effort paying attention to that. Is it a well-run company? And if it is a well-run company, chances are not just the CEOs are good and more competent than the competition, but also the boards are more likely to do their jobs. But it might be that if you pick such a company today, next year your returns aren't that good, and the year after they aren't that good either, right? Compared to, I don't know, putting your money in Nvidia or DeepSeek or whatever it is. So it's the long run that I think, or long-termism versus short-termism, is one of the explanations.
Can you hear board members listening to this going, okay, Dr. Thomas, I hear you. We've got to focus on what are the things that make people good leaders rather than the things that get them into those positions. How should we as a board be assessing our CEO then and whether they're fit for purpose? Because I guess that competence starts with me as a board member in being able to do that.
They're all using executive search firms, and all of those executive search firms are using LinkedIn, and everybody's there, right? And when it comes to evaluating leadership, in a way, you follow the same process as when you evaluate, I don't know, musical talent or talent for playing football or soccer, if you're in America, etc., which is you look at technical expertise, you look at past performance or past behavior, and then you also look at the soft skills like personality, values, intelligence, etc., right? If you're in people love the concept of high potential, and high potential usually means high potential for leadership. You can tell if somebody has potential for these things at a very young age. So typically there's a 2-step process, which is about you start with what is the goal, what is the mandate, the strategy, where does the business or the organization need to go, right? And so to give you examples, it might be that it's more about maintaining what the status quo is. It might be that it's more hypergrowth. It might be that it's more disruptive, innovation, so there is a vision of what needs to happen. And then you fundamentally want people who have the expertise even if AI disrupts or devaluates some of that technical expertise. So we should no longer be hiring leaders for what they know, because what they know is nothing compared to what ChatGPT knows, for example, right, in all areas. And therefore, there is an emphasis on experience, because experience will enable them to connect the dots and connect with others in a way that legitimizes them. And then we've been on this trajectory for the past 15 or 20 years where we are valuing soft skills or the softer side of leadership more and more. Leaders today, including CEOs, need to look almost like an inspirational or motivational football coach. They need to connect with others. They need to be enigmatic, inspirational. And fundamentally, they need to persuade others that they know what's going to happen in the world when, in fact, nobody knows. So they need to sell the vision. Think Napoleon said, a leader is a dealer in hope. And that has never been so true as today. Now, that's the what, right? So imagine fundamentally, if you want to simplify it, you want leaders who are three things: smart, driven, and honest. And if you only have two of them, you're in trouble, right? If they're smart and driven and they're not honest, good luck, run away. If they're honest and smart, but have the wrong drive because they're pathologically ambitious or they're only in it for themselves, also not good. But fundamentally, those are the three things. You can camouflage it. Boards and HR departments love to reinvent the wheel every year and play competency roulette and come up with a new framework for board competencies or CEO competencies. But fundamentally, if you have CEOs or leaders, executives who are smart, driven, and honest, you're going to be fine. How do you assess that? Well, reputation. If you ask people who work for that person, do you trust them? Did they cheat you, or would you leave your children with them? That's a good indicator. And for drive and intelligence, you can use past accomplishments and past performance, but there are psychological assessments that do a much better job. Fundamentally, what is overrated is the interview. And again, all of these executive search firms spend a long time in these 5-hour interviews. You quoted the great Roger Martin. Obviously, congrats on having him on your show, and he's a great thinker on these issues. I can tell you my expertise is assessing leadership potential and talent. And I will tell you, you don't need the interview at all, because the stuff that you actually want to know, you can assess or evaluate it better outside the interview, and the interview will add noise. That narcissistic, incompetent, charismatic, arrogant, but toxic leader that I describe in my book often does really well in interviews. Only psychopaths don't get nervous in high-stakes situations. And because we rely on these shortcuts, and you can't tell if somebody has integrity, curiosity, people skills. But if somebody is in front of you and has this contagious level of charisma, you're going to be like, wow. And that's how you end up with Stephen Ballmer or many of these kind of archetypical salespeople. But it's very different from being really a good people manager or being somebody who looks after the business.
So interesting. And that resonates with how we run the board placements on the platform. We have often advocated for the fact that we are not doing interviews, or we're happy not to do interviews because it just brings our bias into the process. And I was very influenced by the work of Schmidt and Hunter in the 90s with their job-specific tests, structured assessments, and GMA's, general mental ability test, as the three things that actually, they're not perfect, but they're the strongest predictors of success. But what's so amazing to me is how many organizations want that psychological comfort blanket of knowing that you have met them before. And so we do offer that, not because we think it makes any difference, but because we know if we don't, they will feel too uncomfortable using the process, which is a fascinating dynamic. So I love this algorithm of smart, driven, and honest. And I can hear board members listening to this going, oh, that's a nice way of thinking about our next hire. And you mentioned there for smart, the importance of perhaps looking at reputation, doing references maybe to, and I guess there are other things people like Schmidt and Hunter talks about, general mental ability tests, so verbal reasoning, numerical reasoning. But what else can people do who want to tick off that? I guess a lot of that helps on the smart front and maybe some of it on the driven front. On the honest front, you talked about psychometrics. We had in episode 77, Dr. Jeff Smart, the founder of who I'm sure you're familiar with, dismissed psychometrics as junk data on the basis that there are no studies that provide any evidence for the effectiveness of this approach. How does that sit with your way of thinking?
I could go into a fair amount of detail on GA Smart and what they do and their methodology, but the fact is that it's probably about, 10,000 peer-reviewed empirical studies. Since you quoted Schmidt and Hunter, which is incidentally, I think, the most widely cited meta-analysis in the world in the social sciences, and maybe even in the sciences in general, and that has been replicated 5 or 10 times since then. It's incorrect to say there is no evidence, because there is, but I think it is also important to understand how you use different tools exactly for each of these kind of attributes. So I would say integrity, which is about being honest and ethical, is best evaluated by somebody's track record, reputation, etc. Especially if you have been in leadership or in management or in organizational settings for 2-3 decades. I mean, now, it's very difficult to hide. And I mean, this used to be references or letters of recommendation, etc. You still have that, but you also have AI, natural language processing, and of course there are science-based assessments of integrity. If you do all of that, it's still going to be much better than an interview. It's very unlikely that you make a mistake. So think of integrity as a bit like, if I'm thinking of insuring you as a driver, I don't need to give you too many tests. I need to look at how have you driven over the past 20 or 30 years, and that's going to be a pretty good predictor. Of course, something can happen that is unexpected and there are black swan events, but that's going to be really, really good. When it comes to drive, that is a function of personality. And you would give somebody an assessment of their ambition, their conscientiousness, their values. 95% of assessments are rubbish. The 5% that are covered in scientific studies are the anomaly, but it's like everything, right? It's like most music is not great. The 5% that is technically admirable, laudable, few people listen to it. But there are very good assessments for drive, which will measure not just how motivated you are, but what motivates you, what drives you, and you can evaluate also fit between your values and company culture, etc. And now we get into the ability part, which you mentioned. I'm impressed that you are aware of the fact that cognitive ability or raw mental horsepower is so important, because there is a tendency to dismiss it in the real world or in the industry. Even when board members, directors, or CEOs are a little bit allergic to taking a mental ability or a cognitive ability test, they're probably 120, 130, 140 on that. So it's an insecurity that is not based in data. It's more imposter syndrome than anything else. But what's interesting is that if you think about the ability part, there is knowledge and crystallized intelligence and expertise. And that's the part that is not so important today. Before it was very important, like, I don't know, if you want a good CEO or manager for Manchester United, Sir Alex Ferguson was good because he's seen it all, right? And the same goes for a CEO or a chair of a board. But cognitive ability is how fast you can learn going forward. And of course, as the world becomes more complex, intelligence is less about what you know and how fast you can learn things. But even that, how fast you can learn things that are objectively solvable problems, now AI has won the IQ battle. So actually, I would say intellectual curiosity, which includes intellectual humility, because it's quite likely that you have a very smart and knowledgeable CEO or candidate for a board or chair who thinks they know it all. They think they don't need to use generative AI. They think they don't need to learn anything else. And that's the recipe for disaster. The raw mental horsepower starts to decline at the age of 25. I don't know how old you are, but I would guess that, like myself,
I'm already well on the decline.
Already, exactly, yeah. But so we become slower after our 20s, and yet that's not the end. It used to be that you become slower, so you find it harder to solve new problems and to learn new things, but you're wiser because you're more experienced. Now your wisdom and experience don't count that much. But if you have curiosity, you can compensate for that slowing down. And I'm sure people who are in their 70s and 80s and 90s, and they still have this appetite for learning. And it's amazing because they might be using the latest technology at home and they use their smartphones or iPads, etc. And it's not that they're super smart. They are just curious. And so I think that's really important. I even wrote a piece once saying that the chief learning officer or the head of learning and development in an ideal world should be the CEO.
One of the hardest things I found as an independent non-executive compared to my time as an investor director is the lack of a network to support and challenge my thinking in the boardroom. I hope that Enter the Boardroom goes some way to filling that gap. But if you want a more structured, personal space in which to share boardroom challenges and opportunities, I'd recommend our new 12-month NED Mastermind program. Over 6 sessions, you'll meet with a highly accomplished group of 6 to 8 board directors to brainstorm and benchmark boardroom approaches. In each 2-hour session, one member of the group will share their issue or opportunity, for example, how to handle a disengaged CEO. After this, the rest of the group will ask you clarifying questions before offering their ideas. To celebrate our milestone of 100,000 Enter the Boardroom downloads, I'm delighted to offer a 10% discount to all our listeners who sign up between now and the end of March. Head to plus.newroll.com and apply the code ENTER, all lowercase, at checkout. I'm curious, for a board member listening to this, going back to your smart, driven, honest, if they could do one thing across each of those as a way to assess a prospective candidate, can you give them something tangible that they can take away from this?
2 things come to mind. One is when they are assessing a candidate, I think they should assess whether the candidate displays signs of curiosity. How do you assess that? I'm not talking about how many tennis balls do you fit in a 747 and what's the reason. Not this BS. By the way, there are studies on that shows that the only thing you can tell with those questions is how sadistic the interviewer is, which is interesting, right? So it correlates with the sadism in the interviewer. Not that, but I think at the level of a conversation, when they're meeting a candidate and evaluating them, I think you can see whether they read books, they travel, they can talk about things that are happening, they follow the news, they have culture, it will come up. I mean, if you just listen to somebody, you will be able to tell if they have an appetite for knowledge and a hungry mind. And of course, even seeing whether they ask questions as a candidate is a sign of curiosity. I'm not talking about the prepared questions to ask, but reality. So you're probably going to contribute more because of your intelligence, because of your curiosity. So in fact, I am more impressed when people ask questions or make recommendations or say things that are completely unrelated to their past track records because they pick them up now, etc. And I try to do that myself. So I think a board is not so much an invitation to be the smartest person in the room or tell people what you know from my experience, this and that, but actually to show that you are deploying your hungry mind and your curiosity muscle, or you're exercising it. I remember even back when I was doing my PhD and collecting data on this, that I was researching curiosity and creativity a lot. And the best single statement to predict whether somebody had a reputation for being creative and actually contributed to creativity or innovation was, I choose a different route to work every day. Which is actually, I think, why? And it's like, because it's so impractical and inconvenient to do so. But at the same time, it's a consequence of the fact that creativity is linked to high boredom susceptibility or low boredom tolerance, that you seek constant stimulation, and that you are quite happy to self-engineer some serendipity that is inefficient just to absorb new things and new ideas. And there's this beautiful explanation of creativity that says that creativity is a 2-stage process. 1, random variability. 2, rational selection. So for random variability, you need to go outside your comfort zone. Even if you think, and I don't know if we're going to talk about this or not, but I think boards are really a great example for making the case for selecting at the collective level and looking at the configuration. Random variability that can be engineered by having people who are completely different be part of a board versus everybody the same or similar is amazing. Now, it might be that creates chaos, fight, and dissent, but it probably also provides the raw ingredients, combining things in a really novel and original and often completely unconventional and counterproductive way. But sometimes that's where genius comes out.
That's really interesting. One of my observations is where boards often go wrong is where they try and do that divergent thinking or random variability part at the same time as doing the rational selection bit or the convergent thinking, rather than splitting those two things out into two very distinct sections. I really like thinking about that. They're using that as a framework of thinking about who you're hiring. Are you hiring for a spike in random variability, or are you hiring for a spike in rational selection? Can we just go back, though, to your algorithm, which I really liked, as smart, driven, honest? And I want someone listening to this to take away like 3 practical, tangible things that they can go and do. So I guess they could just go and do on the smart side, they could go do a GMA test. On the driven bit, they could go do a reference check, get a bird's eye view and a worm's eye view, someone who worked above the person, someone who worked in an organization well below the person. That honest piece, you talk about those psychometrics. What's you used to be CEO of Hogan Assessments. Is that the sort of thing you've got in mind?
One of my books is called The Talent Delusion. The Talent Delusion talks a lot about assessments, and there's a section of assessments on integrity. But even if we happen to have listeners who are as geeky as you seem to be and interested in this kind of actual direct sources, there is a really good, again, open access article by my colleague and friend, Rob Kaiser. He's very clever, smart, expert in leadership, and he has a paper called How to Assess Integrity. And in that paper, which is a non-technical review, he talks about all of the issues. And he says the best single marker, the best single source is upward feedback. So for a board considering to hire or assess a CEO, go speak to the people that person has managed. That's the number one. As they say, you can fool some people all the time and all of the people sometime, but if you work for somebody for 6 months or 9 months and you have access to them, that's the most important. So not asking a friend or the mother or the father of the candidate, but asking people who work for them what they're like. And the best item there is, did you trust your boss? Did they have your best interest at heart? Yes or no?
You touched earlier on the over-indexation of narcissists who I think you, in your book, talked about occupy 20% of senior leadership roles, and psychopaths who occupy 5% of CEO roles, 5 times more than the population. And for a board member listening to this, how do they identify whether their CEO is a narcissist or a psychopath? Is there a sort of quick check they can run through? And if they identify that they have got someone, is that always a bad thing?
Yeah, these are really quite complex questions. It's important to state that when I talk about narcissism and psychopathy, and when most people talk about it in the context of CEOs, leaders, executives, also board directors, we're usually talking about the non-clinical variant. There is a continuum, and above a certain level, which tends to be an extreme, it's likely that narcissism and psychopathy will be so self-handicapping and maladaptive that people are not going to be that successful. But if there is a continuum, it's like everything, very low can be as bad as very high. And actually, this is a literature that is not often discussed in business publications, the media, etc. But there are a lot of reasons for having a CEO, a managing director, a chairperson, etc., who over-indexes a little bit in narcissism. It's often good for innovation. It's often good for hyper-growth. It's often good for creating a new market, especially if it's coupled with social skills. Having said that, above a certain point, there are usually empathy deficits that are very problematic. There's a level of entitlement and self-centeredness and self-obsession that is also counterproductive. So the disadvantages are clear. How do we identify them? Again, there are assessments for this. There's a paper that was published, again, in an open access journal, but the title is something along the lines of how to evaluate, how to tell if you're a narcissist or how to tell if somebody is a narcissist. So exactly the question you asked. And it has like 11 studies that are reported, but the best measure is narcissists love to tell you that they're a narcissist. So they're basically standing in front of you, hiding in plain sight and saying yes. And it's also useful to remind people or to say that narcissism comes in 2 different kind of shapes. There is what we call the probably less harmful one, which is what we call vulnerable narcissism or neurotic narcissism, which is somebody, a leader or individual who has an inflated sense of self-concept and self-worth and self-esteem. So they're not as good as they think. They're lacking in self-awareness. But they haven't fully kind of come to believe their own BS or their own delusion, right? So there's like, they have an inflated but fragile self-esteem. The best way to actually illustrate it, if you think about David Brent in Ricky Gervais' character of The Office, or Michael Scott, they are textbook vulnerable narcissists. You almost feel a bit sorry for them because ultimately they crave admiration and they are desperately seeking validation. Now, the other side, which is basically grandiose narcissism, and it might come with psychopathic tendencies or not, as people, they don't need your validation, they don't need your feedback. They truly believe they are the best thing since sliced bread, and they will behave accordingly. And if you provide them with any negative feedback, they will retaliate and attack. I won't go into examples of political figures or heads of states or maybe their right-hand person, but I'm sure people can think about that. And I mean, that kind of narcissism is basically uncoachable. And I think it tends to be more toxic than now. It could be that you are even a grandiose narcissist, but you're a genius, right? Not just Steve Jobs, but I mean, if we assess or evaluate Elon Musk, the CEO or the founder, it's plausible that he is a genius. I mean, he seems to have a talent, vision-wise, strategy, even when people think what he's doing is crazy. The problem is that a lot of people with that personality type or style don't have the talents to back it up. So, and it's quite problematic to extrapolate from these figures who are not even in the 0.01%. And of course, I would argue, even if you are a genius, you should behave in a way, being a role model that actually harnesses or ignites some pro-social behavior, some empathy, as opposed to the opposite, right? Antisocial. But you can see there as well. So assessing it is quite usually, I would say maybe the only kind of a message for boards is that when they are impressed or touched or wooed by somebody's charisma, they should actually evaluate whether that's just pure EQ and people skills, or whether that might be part of their psychopathic features, because not so much narcissists, but psychopathic personalities often coexist with tactics of manipulation, people skills, and a very sophisticated kind of repertoire of social skills or people skills to influence others.
So as a board member facing this situation where you've got this toxic leader, whether they're a narcissist or whatever in place, I guess we've talked about the sort of some of the different options you got. You can either kind of you keep them in place because the good outweighs the bad. You can look to try to take them out and recognize there's going to be a high cost to doing that in the short term because it's likely it causes a lot of fallout, or you step back as a board member. Are those your kind of three key options?
Well, there's a fourth one, right? You could still try to coach and develop them. A lot of the times, if they're not like on the Elon Musk or Trump end of the kind of a spectrum of that, I think usually you try to, because if they're adding value, otherwise you just remove them. But if they're adding value and you want to dial down the negatives, they would usually start with coaching, performance management, leadership development, etc. If that doesn't work, then you can run away, pay the price at the organizational level, or you can remove them. Nobody really ever misses toxic, parasitic executive or CEOs or senior leaders once they're removed, because they are very much like parasites or bacteria polluting the whole pond or the whole culture. And then that obviously is contagious.
And I remember once hearing someone say, have you ever fired someone too early? And the answer is, well, no, never regretted firing someone too early. And then they said, well, so how do you know you're firing people early enough? And reading your work, I had a penny drop moment when you sort of highlighted how we have much more confidence from the data in our ability to predict leadership performance than we do about developing it. And I think you actually suggested there is an inverse relationship between our sort of confidence in leadership and the money invested in leadership training. And as a CEO investing heavily right now in leadership training, I'm wondering, should I be worried is it actually worth them allocating those resources or to leadership development? Or should they just be saying, do you know what, 50% of the leadership sort of traits are already established by personality, let's just find the right person?
It's a little bit like now there is this kind of backlash against diversity and inclusion, and all of the companies that we're investing in, we're going to shut down the program straight away, which that's not the point. It's not about kind of throwing the baby out with the water, but it's like there are bad interventions that even if they were well-intended, they weren't providing an ROI and results in the D&I space. And that's the case basically now in leadership development. First has been hijacked or co-opted largely by the self-help movement. It's very problematic because mostly its goal is to inflate leaders' confidence, not to improve their competence. And this is like throwing gasoline to the fire, because these people, if anything, I always say coaching should try to provide leaders with a reality check and to burst the bubble, to decrease the confidence so that it can align with their competence and they have self-awareness. But this is the opposite. Most leadership development is, well, if it's not remedial because you have somebody who is problematic, which is the small or a minority of cases, it's a reward. We're going to invest in you because you have been designated as a usually, or as a emerging leader, or you're in the succession plan, usually for political reasons, usually because you've been very good at manipulating the system. My point is as follows. Leadership development can have value, but you need to connect it with the assessment of potential side. If you invest in those people who are likely to benefit from the development because they have curiosity, integrity, EQ, self-awareness, humility, and because they are coachable, then of course it's like everything. You might have musical talent, but I will invest heavily in your piano lessons or your singing lessons because you have the potential to begin with. Now there is a trend that goes in the other direction. Everybody deserves a coach. In America, also in Britain, everybody's called talent. And it's evaluated usually in terms of satisfaction. If you're an executive, I do some coaching myself, and you have cachet, you can spend £3,000 or £4,000 an hour on a coach. You have what you call handbag coaches, which are signs of status. And then a lot of the best coaches I've met in the world tell me, my goal is to help my clients stay out of trouble, which is ethically questionable, right? Because they should be serving the organization. So assess potential. Assessment should be inclusive, but coaching and development should be very exclusive. Invest in those who actually benefit from it and who are worthy of it, and then measure the impact in terms of what does it do to results, morale, productivity. Measure the impact it has not on the leader's satisfaction, but on those who work for that person.
As I reflect on that, perhaps through my own lens at the moment, which I hope will be helpful for those listening and applying it to their situations, I feel like I can do one half of that right now. I've got the people analytics in place that I can track for that investment that I'm putting into those senior leaderships, the impact that it's having. What I haven't done, listening to you, that it sounds like I need to do, is to assess that leadership group for their suitability for it. So what can I and others listening around there to sort of understand that humility level, the curiosity, coachability, or is it about going and doing a series of sort of Hogan-type assessments?
Yeah. Any science-based could be Hogan, SHL, any Big Five-based assessment, any assessment that has some empirical evidence. You mentioned Deeper Signals, which I co-founded. Same thing. They're shorter and AI-based, but they're all based on that Big Five. And the difference between the good and the bad are that the good, they're harder to game, and we're not taking your answers at face value, but we're comparing your answers to a big group of people who have taken that assessment and for whom we have measures of 360 performance, etc. That's the part that is more art than science. To determine what it is that makes somebody worthy of an investment so that we can upgrade their leadership capabilities for the future must be done in the context of what the strategy is and where you want to go. But chances are that you will care about people skills, right? And if you take somebody with zero EQ, there's no training that can develop them into a Barack Obama or Oprah or whoever you want it to be. Chances are that it's going to include an element of curiosity, right? And chances are that it's going to also include an element of developing expertise and filling in some of the blanks, etc. And we wrote a piece with Josh Bersin, I think, a couple of years ago. Hire leaders, and especially executives, not for what they have done, but for what they could do. And what they could do is an exciting question, because you have to use more assessment, focus on potential, and really think forward, not backwards.
Thomas, time has flown, which means it's time for the lightning round, where I'm going to ask you a short question and ask you for a quick response if you're ready.
Sure.
Best book every board member should read, and why?
I would say Yuval Harari, Homo Deus, even though it's maybe 10 years old, is still the best.
Boardroom behavior that irritates you most?
Doing your Christmas shopping while somebody is presenting. This is not a joke.
Most valuable board ritual?
Listening.
Favorite quote?
The biggest enemy of knowledge is not ignorance, but the illusion of knowledge. Stephen Hawking.
Most significant professional insight?
Confidence is overrated, especially as I come from Argentina. It hit home.
Best professional advice you've ever received?
My PhD supervisor, when I just moved to the UK and I started my PhD coming from Argentina, his advice was, always answer emails fast and always say yes. Then you figure it out. Eventually I had to stop the second, but I still answer very fast.
What have you changed your mind on about boards over time?
Oh, this is a good one. The individual is overrated. And I used to think it's much more about superstars, individuals, whatever. It's really about dynamics and interaction. I'm a big football fan, and it's the same. Although, of course, Messi is the exception, but it's really about the synergy and the interaction. And of course, that means that boards need to do a lot of work together to be a high-performing team. It rarely happens.
When was the last time you got a significant judgment call wrong in the boardroom, and what did you learn?
All the time. I'll give you a big one. When the pandemic started, I said, this is fake news, overrated. And of course, I'm not in the category of people who still think that was the case. My area is mostly innovation, and I was absolutely sure I made terrible investment decisions for me and companies that I run. So all the time. I think Richard Branson said that his baseline is 60% for getting it right. And that's amazing. I would say I'm below 50-50. I learned that it's not about the enthusiasm, the reaction, the gut feel, and the chemistry, but it's about boring things like, if you're judging an innovation, track record, the who matters more than the what or the how. And timing, I think. Sometimes you can be too soon for certain things, certain ideas. So you have to wait until the market settles.
And finally, 3 things our listeners should take away from this episode if they take nothing else.
Follow the science. It's there, and there's a big opportunity to apply it. Then secondly, be an agent of change or for change. I always quote my friend and colleague Giampiero Petriglieri at INSEAD has a great definition of leadership, which is leadership is an argument with tradition. And so I think anybody in a board of directors role is there not to perpetuate the status quo, but to be a vessel between the present and a potential future. So be that change agent. And the last one is that they should exercise their curiosity, not least because their raw mental horsepower is probably slowing down, unless it already has.
Thomas, I have loved that. Thank you so much for taking the time to share your experience and wisdom.
My pleasure. Look forward to listening to what's left, to the cut.